They said the child cried with two voices, one human, one hollow, like wind through an empty church. In 1832, Carolina, even the river seemed to hush when she was born. No doctor could explain her eyes, nor the 11 men who claimed no memory of what they'd done. The Whitmore estate stood just beyond Charleston's edge, where the cypress trees leaned so close to the water, their roots seemed to drink the sky. To the townsfolk, it was known for its beauty. White columns, marble floors, and mirrors in every room. But to those who worked the fields, it was called something else, the House of Glass Silence. Eliza Whitmore was the only daughter of Colonel Thomas Whitmore, a man whose family wealth came from indigo, cotton, and an unflinching cruelty whispered about even in the quarters. Eliza had been blind since birth. Her eyes were a pale, colorless gray, as though she had been born without reflection. She moved through the house, guided by sound and scent, trailing her hand along the cool walls. Her father kept her hidden from guests, ashamed of what he called the family defect. Her mother, long dead, had also gone blind before her death. Some said it was the curse of a woman her husband had wronged. Others said the blindness was mercy, sparing them from seeing what truly went on behind those mirrored walls. The slaves spoke of hearing her at night, walking barefoot through the halls, singing softly to someone unseen. Sometimes she would stop at the slave quarters door and whisper a name perfectly. No one had told her those names. In 1832, when the colonel's wealth began to falter after a series of crop failures, a rumor spread that he had made a new arrangement, not with merchants or banks, but with his own blood. Eliza, the blind daughter, was to be paired, not married, to 11 of his strongest male slaves. Each man was told it was for science, for God, for the preservation of something pure. The day before it began, Eliza stood by the window, feeling the sun through the glass. "He says he will make me see," she murmured to the housekeeper. "But I already see more than he does." That night, the mirrors in the great hall were covered in cloth. And for the first time in 30 years, the music room doors were locked from the outside. Tell me in the comments, if you were there, would you have tried to stop it, or turned away like everyone else? Colonel Thomas Whitmore was a man who measured life in dominion and obedience. To him, the body was property, and the soul was irrelevant. By 1832, Carolina's heat had set the estate ablaze with its own languid rhythm, but inside the Whitmore mansion a colder tension hung, one that smelled of candle wax, damp wood, and fear. Eliza, unaware of the true horror about to unfold, was guided into the great hall by her nurse, a worn woman named Martha. The chamber was lined with mirrors, now veiled with heavy cloth, trapping the dim candlelight into pools of shadow. 11 men waited silently, chained loosely at the wrists. Each bore the marks of both labor and obedience, thick scars from the fields, calloused hands and eyes that darted nervously toward the colonel. Whitmore addressed them from his raised chair, his voice as cold as the marble beneath his boots. "This is not cruelty," he declared. "It is legacy. God's law demands purity, and we shall create it." He gestured to his daughter. "Eliza will serve as vessel. You will serve as instruments. No harm beyond instruction is permitted. Obedience ensures reward." The men said nothing. Their silence was heavier than chains. And Eliza, blind to the world, yet attuned to every whisper, every tremor in the floorboards, sensed the enormity of what was to come. She reached out her hands instinctively, fingers brushing against the cold wood of the table, tasting the scent of dust and iron. Night fell. The colonel retreated, leaving the housekeeper and a few overseers to observe. What followed was recorded in whispers and journals later recovered from the estate. Each man, one after another, was led to Eliza's side. The sessions were never spoken of outside the mansion. They were measured, methodical, and timed with the swing of the grandfather clock that loomed over the hall. By the 10th day, Eliza's body was left exhausted, her voice hoarse from crying that no one witnessed. The men avoided her gaze, trembling under the weight of what they had been forced to do, as if the act itself had branded their souls. Yet even in the horror, Eliza noticed patterns. The cadence of the overseer's footsteps, the pauses in the colonel's orders, the way the candlelight flickered against her face. She remembered everything, though she could see nothing. And on the night of the 11th man, something changed. The house seemed to lean in closer, the air thick, suffocating. From the shadows came a sound no one expected. A low, keening moan, almost human, almost something else. "Would you have stayed in the room?" or fled into the Carolina night. The spring of 1833 arrived with a suffocating heat, pressing down on the Whitmore estate as if the sun itself conspired with fate. Eliza Whitmore, weakened but unbroken, was carried to the chamber prepared for the final stage of the Colonel's experiment. Her body, exhausted from months of coercion, trembled as though anticipating the future even before it was born. Colonel Whitmore insisted that the birth be documented meticulously. Overseers and the housekeeper, Martha, watched from a distance, recording every sound and movement. The candles cast long, wavering shadows against the walls, and the scent of wax mixed with the unmistakable tang of sweat and fear. It was a room devoid of warmth, where humanity had been replaced by calculation. When the child came, the entire house seemed to pause. Eliza's cries echoed through the halls, mingling with the soft, panicked murmurs of the slaves who had participated. But the infant was unlike any other. Its body bore unnatural fractures, limbs bent at impossible angles, skin mottled with strange hues. Even Martha, hardened by decades of service, could not hide her gasp. Colonel Whitmore, in his obsession with legacy, refused to believe that the child's deformities were anything but divine. "This is proof," he muttered, "that we have done what God intended. Strength will rise from weakness." But the truth was undeniable. The child was a living symbol of corruption, a corporeal indictment of every act that had led to this moment. The slaves whispered in the corners, fearful that even speaking might summon the Colonel's wrath. "It is cursed," one murmured, barely audible over the infant's wails. "It carries the sins of all who touched her mother." Eliza, though blind, sensed the enormity of the disaster. She touched the child's tiny form, feeling every contortion, every tremor, and her sobs were the only true response in the room. The house itself seemed to shudder, as though the walls recoiled from what had been brought into the world. By nightfall, the news had spread to the riverfront workers, the townsfolk, and even the neighboring plantations. Carolina had witnessed a birth that no one could explain, a birth that would forever mark the Whitmore name and the estate itself with an invisible stain. The infant survived, but it was clear that nothing, no person, no structure, no family, would ever be the same. The estate, once a symbol of wealth and power, now carried a darkness that even the sun could not burn away. Tell me in the comments, if this was your family, what would you have done? The birth of the child did not remain confined to the Whitmore mansion. Even as the infant wailed through the night, its cries seemed to seep into the quarters where the slaves lived, settling over the small cabins like a storm of unseen weight. The men who had participated in the Colonel's experiment began to whisper of strange occurrences, dreams filled with screaming, shadows that moved against the flicker of lantern light, and a sensation that the infant's gaze, though unseen, followed them everywhere. One of the older slaves, Joseph, claimed he awoke to find tiny handprints on his chest, damp as river mud, though the child had not been near him. Another, Ruth, swore she heard Eliza singing lullabies that no living mouth could produce. Her soft voice carried on the wind through the cracked walls of the cabins. Fear and guilt fused into a tangible presence, choking the air with tension. By midsummer, the curse began manifesting physically. Livestock fell ill inexplicably, crops failed in patches where soil once promised abundance, and small fires erupted without cause. Even the river, usually calm and reflective, turned murky and choked with driftwood, as if it recoiled from the estate itself. Colonel Whitmore, ever determined to control outcomes, ordered the infant moved into the nursery at the rear of the mansion. But even there, the child's presence seemed to corrupt everything it touched. Mirrors cracked without reason, the waxen candles dripped in shapes resembling tiny, pleading faces, and the nursemaids whispered of a faint, unearthly glow that pulsed from the child during the full moon. The men who had been part of Eliza's ordeal grew restless and paranoid. Henry, one of the strongest among them, claimed he saw figures rising from the floors at night, silently pointing toward the nursery. Others became ill, afflicted with fevers and shaking that would not subside, as if the child carried within her the echo of every horror inflicted in the mansion. By autumn, even the neighboring plantation owners began to speak of the Whitmore estate in hushed tones. Carolina, it seemed, had taken notice. The name Whitmore became synonymous with misfortune, whispered with dread. The estate, once a monument to wealth and refinement, now radiated a silent menace, its halls echoing with the Consequences of ambition twisted into obsession, and in the nursery the child's cries never ceased, a sound that would forever haunt the quarters, the mansion, and those who dared to witness what had been born. Would you have dared enter the nursery, or fled Carolina forever? Eliza Whitmore, though blind, possessed a perception that no one could deny. She navigated the halls with the precision of a hawk, listening to the rhythm of footsteps, feeling the tremor in the floorboards, and smelling the faintest trace of human emotion. The events that had unfolded were horrifying, yet she understood more than anyone. The child was not merely ill. She was a reflection, a living ledger, of every transgression, every act forced upon her, every betrayal of flesh and faith. By the second month after the birth, Eliza began whispering to the nurses and even to the slaves who would dare approach. "She hears what we do not," she said, running her hand over the child's head. "And she remembers. Everything, every command, every touch, every fear. If we are not careful, all Carolina will know her sorrow." Her words were dismissed at first, as if blindness bred delusion. But then the subtle signs emerged. Candles would flicker violently whenever someone approached the nursery with ill intent. Items would vanish from rooms, only to reappear in places the child could reach without anyone seeing. Slaves reported hearing sobbing and laughter together in the same breath coming from the child, though she was only a few months old. Eliza sensed it all. The power she could not see, the knowledge she could not fully express. She began leaving the child's cradle in different rooms, testing the reactions of the household. Objects would tip, ink would smear, shadows would twitch, and servants would tremble. She realized the child was not merely affected by the sins of others. She was active, a conduit for them, a warning. The colonel noticed changes in his daughter. Her calm voice began to carry authority, even over him. "Do not approach the child without care," she commanded one evening, her words soft yet absolute. "She is not yours to control, and neither is what has begun within her." Yet Thomas Whitmore, stubborn and deaf to reason, ignored her warnings. The child's cries became unbearable on certain nights, echoing like bells through the mansion. Slaves swore that the child's cries carried names, whispered accusations of every man who had touched her mother. And in the dead of night, Eliza would sit by the nursery, holding her hands near the child's body, feeling the pulse of Carolina itself. She sensed a fracture forming, a spreading darkness, and understood that what had begun in that room would not remain private. The consequences would reach far beyond the mansion walls. Tell me in the comments, if you could see through her eyes, what would you have done to stop the horrors? The 11 men who had been forced into Eliza's chamber carried their guilt like a living weight. They moved silently through the plantation, their eyes hollowed by the memory of what had transpired. But the child, born fractured yet strangely aware, did not allow them to forget. In the quiet hours, she would cry, and each man swore he heard his own voice answering, accusing, demanding atonement for sins they could not escape. At night, the men gathered secretly in the quarters, whispering of strange phenomena. Tools would vanish from the sheds, only to be found neatly stacked in patterns no one had arranged. Shadows moved independently of the men, elongating and shifting as if guided by the infant's unseen presence. They began to see her reflection in mirrors, though she was never placed near one, her pale, deformed eyes staring back with intelligence beyond her months. Joseph, the eldest of the group, was the first to speak aloud. "She knows us," he muttered, pacing the floorboards. "Not the one you think, but all of us. Every act we were forced to commit, every command we obeyed. It is remembered, and it is judging." The men realized that their participation had bound them to the child, a connection deeper than chains, stronger than fear. Even when they slept, they were visited in dreams by figures emerging from the nursery, tiny hands reaching for their hearts. Some woke with scratches along their arms, others with inexplicable bruises shaped like letters, initials, names, numbers, recording their complicity. The plantation itself seemed to react. Windows shattered spontaneously during storms, lanterns extinguished in their hands, and the air carried the faint metallic scent of blood, though none was present. The child's cries reverberated in the halls like a verdict, growing louder whenever any man approached her. Colonel Whitmore noticed the change. His men, once obedient and silent, were now withdrawn, hesitant, haunted. He accused them of cowardice, but even he could not deny the transformation. Something in the infant had taken hold, a power that no amount of wealth or authority could suppress. By the third month, the men avoided the nursery entirely, walking past it as if its very threshold carried a curse. Yet each night, when the house settled into silence, they would hear it again, the child's cry, calling them, naming them, marking them. And somewhere in the shadows, Eliza whispered softly, "She is not ours. She belongs to Carolina now." Would you have faced her, or run and never looked back? By the summer of 1833, whispers of the Whitmore estate's unnatural birth spread beyond the plantation walls. The child's cries had become more than just a sound. They were a herald of calamity. Livestock weakened inexplicably, crops wilted in precise rows, and the river that bordered the estate began to shift unnaturally, rising in places without rainfall. Carolina seemed to recoil from the house, as if aware that the hollow within carried a force beyond mortal comprehension. The slaves who remained dared not speak openly, but they documented subtle, horrifying patterns. Wells that once gave clear water turned bitter and foul, the soil blackened in patches where nothing would grow. Windows would fog with strange symbols overnight, wiped clean in the morning to reveal imprints of hands and faces, elongated and distorted, frozen in silent screams. Even birds and insects avoided the vicinity, leaving the estate unnaturally quiet, save for the child's constant wailing. Colonel Whitmore, ever proud, refused to acknowledge the implications. "This is divine testing," he insisted to visitors, though even his voice trembled when speaking the words. The household began to fracture under the pressure. Nurses became ill or fled, servants disappeared without explanation, and the 11 men who had participated in the experiment grew pale and haunted. Some claimed they saw shadows clinging to the walls, echoing their own gestures, following them through hallways, or emerging in the candlelight to whisper accusations. Eliza, though blind, understood the curse better than anyone. She moved silently through the mansion, sensing the child's pulse as a living force, noting how it resonated with the fear and guilt embedded in every corner. "She does not belong here," Eliza whispered one night, tracing the nursery's doorframe. "She belongs to Carolina, and she will not forgive." It was during one particularly oppressive evening that the first tragedy struck. A field hand, Matthew, was found lifeless in the river. His body bore no visible wounds, yet his eyes were wide open in a frozen scream. Others swore that when he was found, a faint infantile cry came from the direction of the nursery, cutting through the night like a knife. After that, the estate became a place of whispered terror. Townsfolk avoided the main road leading to the plantation, crossing the river at great lengths to bypass it. Stories spread of shadows walking independently, voices speaking in unknown tongues, and an infant whose cries carried power far beyond comprehension. And in the quiet moments, when the wind stirred the cypress leaves just right, some swore they could hear the child laughing, a sound devoid of joy and full of inevitability. If you lived in this town, would you have stayed, or run and never looked back? By late 1833, Colonel Thomas Whitmore's mind began to fracture under the weight of the estate's growing horrors. Once a man of commanding presence, he now walked the halls like a ghost tethered to his own ambition. The child's cries followed him, echoing in mirrors, in empty rooms, in the shadows that crept closer with each passing night. Even the walls seemed to pulse with judgment. He tried to control it. He inspected the nursery daily, noting the child's every twitch and movement, consulting charts and ledgers he kept in secret. Yet no calculation, no decree, could contain what had been unleashed. Candles would burn unevenly, wax dripping in symbols he could not interpret. Furniture would shift slightly overnight, as though avoiding the child's gaze. Whispers emanated from corners where no one could stand. The 11 men, still present but weakened by fear and guilt, avoided him. Their eyes held a mixture of terror and defiance, knowing that even the colonel could not undo what had begun. At night, some swore the child's cry morphed into his own voice, mocking him with every command he had issued, every order he had forced upon others. Eliza, still blind, wandered the mansion quietly, sensing the shift in her father. She had learned to interpret the child's wails as messages, not of pain but of revelation. "He does not see," she whispered to Martha, the housekeeper, "but he feels, and soon he will understand what no man can escape." By the 7th month, the colonel's behavior became erratic. He spoke to mirrors, demanding obedience from his own reflection, and sometimes to the walls, claiming he saw faces of men and women who had vanished in the past months. His commands became harsher, more desperate, yet the child's presence rendered him powerless. One night, a lantern fell in the nursery, igniting a small fire. The colonel rushed to save the infant, but the flames extinguished themselves as if the house itself intervened. Panic overtook him, and he began to see the child everywhere, on the staircase, in the parlor, in the reflection of a polished table. By dawn he was mumbling incoherently, wandering the estate with no purpose, his mind a labyrinth of fear and remorse. The estate had claimed him in spirit, if not yet in body. Townsfolk spoke of a man seen screaming into the wind, pointing at unseen forms, cursing God, man, and child alike. And through it all, the child's cries never ceased, a reminder that the curse was not his alone, but belonged to Carolina itself. Would you have confronted him, or left him to the madness he had wrought? By the winter of 1834, the Whitmore estate was no longer recognizable as a home. The great house, once a symbol of wealth and power, sagged under its own weight, its white columns gray with mold and dust. Roof tiles had fallen into the courtyard, and the windows were opaque with grime. Even the cypress trees surrounding the property seemed to recoil, their roots twisting like hands trying to escape the soil. The child, now nearing her first year, had become the axis of the estate's decay. Her cries echoed through every hall, every creaking floorboard, every shuttered window. Servants who had once dared to sleep near the nursery now fled, leaving only Eliza, the 11 men, and a handful of housekeepers too loyal or too fearful to leave. Colonel Whitmore was a shell of a man. He had stopped eating, wandering the halls at night, muttering to the shadows, and sometimes to the child directly. "You were meant to be mine," he screamed into the nursery, but his words were swallowed by the echoing silence of the collapsing walls. Even the mirrors, once instruments of his pride, were now cracked and clouded, reflecting distorted fragments of the mansion's despair. Outside, the land itself seemed to resist the estate. Water from the nearby river began to encroach on the fields, softening the soil and swallowing the crops. Horses refused to graze near the house, birds abandoned their perches, and insects avoided the estate altogether, leaving the air heavy with a strange quiet, as though nature itself mourned the corruption born within those walls. The 11 men, too terrified to act openly, whispered of apparitions that stalked them at night. They spoke of seeing their own shadows twisted into grotesque shapes, reaching for them as if demanding acknowledgement of sins committed. Some began to fall ill with fevers, shaking fits, or visions that left them screaming in the halls. Eliza, blind but perceptive, moved with a terrifying calm through the chaos, guiding the child away from danger, soothing her cries and observing the slow, inevitable ruin of everything the colonel had claimed as his own. "The estate cannot stand," she murmured. It was never meant to. By spring, the mansion's eastern wing collapsed under the pressure of rot and neglect. The nursery, once the center of all that horror, was buried beneath rubble, leaving the child unharmed yet surrounded by the debris of her own legacy. And as the final beams cracked and fell, those who survived swore they heard the child laugh, a sound that was neither innocent nor cruel, but resolute, echoing across Carolina like a promise that the estate's curse had not ended, only transformed. Would you have stayed to witness the collapse, or run and never looked back? By 1835, the story of the Whitmore estate had begun to seep beyond Carolina's borders. Travelers spoke in hushed tones at inns along the rivers. Merchants exchanged fearful whispers in Charleston's markets, and even neighboring plantations began to notice a shift in the wind, as though the child's presence carried itself invisibly across the landscape. Reports came of animals refusing to enter fields near abandoned homesteads, of crops failing without cause, and of travelers seeing fleeting shadows that mimicked human form but moved unnaturally. Those who lingered too long reported hearing distant cries, not only the infant's wails, but multiple voices, overlapping and distorted, as if the child's presence had multiplied in the air itself. The 11 men, now scattered across Carolina and the surrounding low country, carried the weight of their complicity. They spoke in cryptic terms of visions and hauntings that followed them. Joseph claimed he awoke to find his own reflection leaning over him at night, whispering names he had never known. Another man, Samuel, swore he saw the child standing in river shallows, her pale, malformed eyes watching him silently, even though he was miles away. Eliza Whitmore, still blind and unyielding, had become a figure of quiet authority. She moved with uncanny awareness, predicting events before they occurred. To her, the estate's collapse was only the beginning. The child was a seed that had taken root, and Carolina itself would bear the consequences. She wrote letters she never sent, warning distant relatives, yet even as she tried, she knew the child's influence was unstoppable. Colonel Whitmore, broken and wandering the wreckage of his once great house, vanished entirely. Some said he drowned in the river, claimed by the waters that had long watched over the estate. Others whispered that he had become part of the shadows themselves, wandering forever, calling the child's name in anguish. The child survived and grew, her presence marking every place she touched. Carolina became haunted not by ghosts alone, but by the consequences of one man's obsession and the innocence that had been weaponized against her. By the time the first whispers reached Georgia and Virginia, the legend of the blind daughter and her cursed birth had spread like wildfire, leaving communities uneasy, farms blighted, and minds unsettled. Even now, the waters of the rivers, the creaking of old cypress trees, and the winds through the low country speak of her, though no living soul has seen her for decades. Those who feel her presence do not speak of joy or evil, only inevitability. The knowledge that some events leave scars upon the land itself, scars that generations cannot erase. Tell me in the comments, do you believe this was fate? Or something far darker? By the late 1830s, Carolina itself bore the imprint of the Whitmore curse. The estate had crumbled, the fields lay fallow, and the river carved new paths, as if to erase any trace of what had occurred. Yet the child, the blind daughter, had not vanished. Her presence lingered like a shadow etched into the soil, a whisper carried by the wind through every cypress grove and marshy delta. Families who had fled the estate told tales that spread like wildfire. Travelers described hearing cries that seemed to come from the earth itself, voices rising from empty fields, or the distant laughter of a child whose form was never visible. Even crops planted in the surrounding area failed inexplicably, livestock sickened, and servants and laborers who attempted to farm near the estate often fell ill or went mad. Carolina itself had fractured, its land and people scarred by the legacy of one horrifying birth. Eliza Whitmore, now older, moved silently through the ruins of the mansion, guiding the child with her voice and hands. Though blind, she understood what the rest of the world could not. The child was more than human. She was a living testament, a vessel of memory, bearing witness to the acts that had created her. Each day, the child's cries became a map of accountability, touching the hearts of all who had survived, revealing the sins of the past in ways that no law or preacher could undo. The 11 men who had participated in her conception became spectral figures in Carolina's folklore. Some disappeared entirely. Others wandered, broken and haunted, their lives forever intertwined with the child's. Each carried the weight of their actions like a shadow, never free, always aware that the child's presence was both accusation and reminder. Decades passed, but the land retained its memory. Generations of farmers and settlers reported glimpses of a pale, malformed child moving silently through the fields at dusk. Her cries, sometimes distant and mournful, sometimes sharp and accusatory, reminded all who heard them that the past was never truly buried. The Whitmore estate no longer existed, but the legacy endured. Carolina was fractured not merely by geography, but by the moral rupture that began in a single chamber. A blind daughter, 11 men, and the dark will of a man who refused to see the consequences of his own cruelty. And so, even today, when the wind bends the cypress trees just so, when the river murmurs along the low country, some swear they hear her cry, not a plea for comfort, but a reminder that certain acts leave marks upon the world itself, marks that no one can erase. Would you have faced her, or left Carolina forever, haunted by what you could not unsee?